Welcome to Therapy in the Great Outdoors, a podcast about the business and practice of nature-based pediatric therapy of all kinds. If you are a nature-loving therapist who works with children, this podcast will help you start taking your work outdoors into nature and help you grow a profitable nature-based therapy practice or program that connects children to nature and changes their lives and yours forever. I'm your host, the ever honest, always 100% real, Laura Park Figueroa. I have been a pediatric occupational therapist for over 20 years. But 7 years ago, I almost left the field entirely. I was so burned out. And nature-based therapy is what saved me. It reignited my love of my work, and I saw profound changes in the children that I was working with. I'm the founder of Outdoor Kids OT and the creator of the TGO approach, an evidence-based framework for nature-based pediatric therapy services. I've helped dozens of pediatric therapists start and grow successful nature-based practices through my business coaching and online programs, the latest of which is the Therapy in the Great Outdoors community, TGO for short. TGO is an online membership site with loads of resources to support you every step of the way as you start and grow your nature-based therapy work. You can find out more at therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com. Working outdoors with children can be a wild ride. Are you ready for the adventure? Let's jump in. Hello, friends. I'm recording this on a beautiful, brilliantly blue sky morning with just a couple of puffy white clouds outside and palm trees blowing in the breeze outside my window because I am in California for a visit right now. And I'm recording on a Saturday because next week I am heading to the Children in Nature Network conference in Atlanta. So I wanted to get this episode out for all of you. I'm committed to doing weekly episodes for at least the first few months here to give you a bunch of helpful information about nature-based practice. So today, for our 2-minute takeaway, which is the part of our podcast where I review quickly an article that relates to our nature-based therapy work with children. Today, I chose an article that is specifically for those of you who are speech therapists, because I have been really surprised in the research how there are several articles specifically about communication and social interaction in children outdoors. This study is called Responding to Nature: Natural Environments Improve Parent-Child Communication. It was published in 2018 in the Journal of Environmental Psychology. This article was a within subjects experimental design. So much of the literature on nature-based therapy or nature-based interventions for children or forest school programs, all of this literature we have to inform our practice, much of it is qualitative literature. So this is a really cool study because it was a true experimental study. In this study, they took 18 parent-child pairs of 3 to 4-year-old children with a parent, and the parents wore cameras. And they were looking at the effect of environment on parent-child interactions during exploration of a natural environment in nature outdoors and an indoor environment, which was the indoor environment they used was a nature-focused education center, so like a nature center indoors. And what they did was they gave the directions for the next 15 minutes. I want you to go on a treasure hunt, see what you can find. So they had them do this exploration or this treasure hunt indoors in the nature center inside, and then also outdoors in the nature environment in the wooded area surrounding the nature center. They were looking at connectedness and responsiveness in communication. So connectedness was defined as sequences of conversational turns that were meaningfully linked, and responsiveness was defined as instances where speakers follow and respond to the content of their social partner's utterances. So the coolest findings in this study came up. So the first was that children are significantly more talkative in nature, even though the parents were not. That is so incredible, right? The second was there were longer connected communication episodes outdoors. The third was that the pairs of the parents and children responded more frequently to one another outdoors, and they discovered that with a paired samples t-test. And then finally, they found that grammatical and lexical diversity, so the diversity of the words they were using and the kind of construction of their communication was the same across both settings. So the outdoor environment, the nature environment, fostered that sense of connectedness in communication between parents and their children. So the takeaways for us in nature-based practice, I think, are many, but some of the recommendations and takeaways that they had in this article were that nature may promote attention between people. One of their hypotheses was that maybe nature lowered stress and helped boost moods to then facilitate connection between parents and children. They suggested that nature may offer a way to support parent-child communication to affect children's cognition and social development. So another really interesting thing that they stated was that Western culture parenting occurs mainly indoors, and in other cultures, this may not be as true. And so they suggested that interdisciplinary research was recommended to assess if their findings were true across cultures, as well as for peer communication and connection. So I know that is something that many of us are concerned about as well. So just a really cool article. I hope you enjoyed this little review, especially if you're a speech therapist. I think there's very clear evidence here to say you can take your children outdoors, and that is an evidence-based practice for your therapeutic work with kids. Okay. Today, the topic for our podcast is assessment. So some of you had asked me to talk about this as a topic on the podcast. So I'm listening to listener requests. If you want to put one in, feel free to message me on the Therapy in the Great Outdoors community. You can go to therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com to join. It's free, and you can message me there. You can DM me, or you can send me a message on Instagram at Laura Park Fig. So if there's something you want to hear on the podcast, please let me know. This was a listener request for me to talk about assessment. So the first thing I want to say that I think is very important is that therapy requires assessment. It is part of our therapeutic process to assess children. And in this episode, when I'm talking about assessment and therapy assessment of children for therapy services, I want to be very clear that I'm using an individual focus. I'm not using a population-based model of care. So I know in the occupational therapy profession, there are OT practitioners that use a population-based model. So I'm trying to think of a good example of this, where maybe you're developing a program for people who are homeless, something like that, where it's like you're not individually assessing the individual needs of those people. You are assessing the population and then developing a program for them. So you could do this in nature-based therapy, right? But I will talk in a little bit about why I use an individualized focus when I think about assessment for nature-based therapy services. So the words we use matter. And when we call something therapy or when we call something therapeutic, that communicates to people that we are offering a specific service that is therapy for their child, okay? We are bound by the requirements of our licensed professions. So whatever profession you are, you need to know the requirements for your scope of practice, for your profession. What does your profession require you to do in the assessment process? Do the work to understand this so that you are making sure that you're providing services in alignment with your profession, as well as services that really get good outcomes for people. So in my opinion, this is just my opinion, okay? In my opinion, individualized assessment of each child or their family needs, like the child seen as in the context of their family, that to me is the client, right? In the services we're providing for children. Individualized assessment of each client, of each child and their family and their needs is what sets therapy apart from an enrichment service or an outdoor play service or a forest school program. As therapists, we need to be able to communicate the how and the why of what we're doing. An assessment of each individual child and their family helps us to do that. So that is how we get really good outcomes in therapy. Now, I'm not saying that an enrichment service or outdoor play or forest school programs aren't amazing. Yes, they're absolutely supportive to children's development, but they're not therapy. So assessing is what sets us aside as therapists. It sets us apart as experts, and it helps us really look at what is going on with that child, looking underneath, looking at the underlying factors that may be influencing the challenges that the child has. For whatever reason the parent or caregiver brought that child to therapy, we have to be able to assess to find those. But so I may be like overstating this point and preaching to the choir a little bit, because I know all of you are professionals and you assess well. Assessment sets us apart, and therapy requires assessment. Now, the second thing I want to say is that you are licensed in your profession. And something that might surprise you that I'm going to say is that many of the assessments that you currently use in your practice as a pediatric therapist are appropriate to use when you are providing nature-based therapy services. So I know there are several therapists out there that I've talked with about this in some of my research and just in my professional connections and networking with people. We have to lead with the therapy that we are, right? So nature-based therapy is not like a thing. It's not like a licensed profession. It's kind of just a general category, that kind of the term I use for pediatric therapist of any kind who work outdoors in nature with children. But you are licensed in your specific profession. There is a standard of care that you have to use in your profession. There are ethical obligations you have. And so using the assessments that you typically use for children to assess whatever you are working on in the outdoor setting is completely appropriate in nature-based therapy. So for example, in occupational therapy, maybe you're going to use the sensory processing measure. We use that in my practice at Outdoor Kids OT. We use the sensory processing measure as one of our assessments prior to placing children in services. And that is an assessment that you could use in a clinic setting as well. But because we are going to be addressing sensory processing in our sessions, we want to have a measure of that and use a standardized assessment for that to really guide our treatment and help us with treatment planning. Another example might be for physical therapists, you might do the BOT, the Brunick's test. So the BOT is an assessment you would use in a clinic, but you can use it prior to nature-based services in order to inform your services and to measure if your services helped a child to improve their physical skills, their motor coordination. So those are just a couple of examples. There are a million. So I want you to think about, as I'm talking about this, what are the assessments that you typically use in your therapy practice right now, and how might those be beneficial in a nature-based setting as well, and be used maybe as just measures of achievement or measures of your outcomes to really use a standardized measure to see if your services are making change. So I should say here that one thing that was really surprising to me in my PhD coursework, when I did a course on assessments, like an entire class on assessment and a design of assessments. And one of the things that was really surprising to me, that I think if you're an OT or an occupational therapy professional, you'll be surprised at too, is that really standardized assessments are not necessarily like the gold standard in OT. Like I can't think of how to communicate it here, but I guess what I should say is that non-standardized assessments, clinical observations, really using your skills as a therapist to observe what's going on, is a valid form of assessment. You are not required, well, I shouldn't say this for all professions because I'm talking to like a multidisciplinary crowd here, but you may not be required to do a standardized assessment in order to get really good data. If you do really good clinical observations and really use a framework or a theory to guide your thinking in order to inform your treatment planning and your goal setting, then maybe you don't need to do a standardized assessment. And I think that may surprise some of you. It really surprised me when I read that in some of the occupational therapy literature that I reviewed in my PhD program. So just consider that, consider that you could create a non-standardized assessment. So an example of this could be what we just created in my practice, which is a 40 question checklist. There's 20 questions for social emotional skills, and there's 20 questions for sensory motor skills. And, that checklist that we created is just a strengths-based checklist. Everything is written in very positive terms for parents to give us a little window into the strengths and challenges that their child has in those two different developmental areas. So that's an example of a non-standardized method of assessment. We haven't gone through statistical analysis with this questionnaire checklist, but it is something that really informs our placing children into groups in a way that is effective and appropriate for the group to be well balanced. And it also gives us some information about the child based on, we created that checklist specifically to ask about things that we want to know about before we bring a child into services so that we can know them a little bit and know how we can really support them. So that's just an example of a non-standardized assessment. Okay, so you can use your typical assessments usually. You can also consider using non-standardized methods of assessment. And then finally, the last thing I want to say on this episode about this topic is to consider assessing nature connection. So one of the things also that surprised me in my PhD work, in this same class, actually, the assessment class that I took, we were required to look at the creation and kind of analyze the methods that certain assessments went through to create the assessment. And I was so surprised to find out that there are actually assessments that measure nature connection in children. And I didn't even know that was a thing before I took this class and had to do this assignment. So I should define what I mean by nature connection. Nature connection in the literature is defined as both feeling and emotion, as well as a cognitive understanding. So it's a feeling of being connected to nature, an emotion of loving nature, of feeling a connection, right? But then it's also the cognitive understanding of yourself as a part of nature. And that's what kind of leads to the desire to protect nature, to take care of nature, and that environmentalism that we hope all children have when they grow into adults, right? Who care about the world and the earth and protecting the earth. So nature connection is feeling and cognitive. It's both emotional and cognitive. So the thing that I want to reiterate, that I keep reminding myself of, is what we assess is what we address. Okay, so if you are not assessing nature connection in your practice, now, true confession, we don't measure this yet at Outdoor Kids OT. So I'm talking here from like what I think might be best practice and what I would like to start doing in the future. But we have not, like, logistically, we've just found it hard to work into our systems, adding on a nature connection assessment into our like intake and start of the year processes. So even as I say this, I'm like, maybe we should do it this fall when we start up groups again. So maybe this recording this episode will motivate me to do this. But I share it here as fodder for your thinking, because measuring nature connection and using maybe some of these nature connection assessments with children as part of your intake process for your nature-based pediatric therapy work actually can communicate to families that what you are actively looking at is a child's connection to nature as part of their overall, the holistic picture to support their health and well-being right now as a child and also in the future when they're adults. I truly believe that nature connection is so important for children to have when they're young, because it gives them this sense of safety in nature and a connection in nature that they can go back to time and time and time again until the day they die. It affects them forever. This work is so important. So when we assess nature connection, when we use an assessment that actually measures nature connection, that's the whole purpose of the assessment, then we communicate to families that we're going to be looking at this in our therapy sessions. What we assess is what we address. So it helps us as therapists to consider nature connection, as well as communicates to families that we find that important, and it makes it a focus as of part of our therapy. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 different nature connection assessments that you might consider using. There are many others that I go into in the Contigo Approach online course, but for purposes of this podcast, I'll just list out a few and you can do some research, Google these and find them. I believe they're all publicly available, but you do need to do a little bit of research to understand how to use them. They're all fairly simple rating scales or questionnaires that you use. So the first one is the Connection to Nature Index. That's for children 8 to 12 years. It's commonly referred to as the CNI for short. The second is the Connection to Nature Index for parents of preschool children. So it's CNI-PPC. And that's for children 2 to 5 years of age. That's a questionnaire for parents to assess their children's nature connection. And then the final one is called the Nature Connection Index, the NCI. And that one is for children ages 7 through adulthood. So that one covers a very wide range. Many of these are very short and easy to use. They are not long. They don't take a very long time. Now, with any assessment, you're going to have to do the research to learn it yourself and know how to give it in a way that is appropriate with the standardization of the tool, right? But I promise you that those three that I just listed are fairly easy to learn and very quick and easy to administer. Even as I hear myself saying this, I'm like, I got to start doing this in my practice. I want to be able to do research in the future to see if the changes that we see in therapy with developmental skills actually correlate with changes in nature connection. I think that would be a really interesting study to do in the future because, I have to finish the dissertation research that I'm trying to do right now. So I'm in the little bit of overwhelm phase with the data analysis right at this moment. So that was you heard the overwhelm in my voice there. So those are 3 different nature connection assessments to consider using in your work with children. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. I hope this was helpful to you, and I would love to discuss more. We now have a space inside of the Therapy in the Great Outdoors free community that is just for the podcast. So if you have thoughts on this topic, go to the podcast link in the Therapy in the Great Outdoors community, and we can discuss there. I would love to hear more about if you're using nature connection assessments in your nature-based practice or just what you think about assessment in general. I would love to discuss this more with all of you. So I'll see you there. Bye. Thank you so much for spending time with me today, exploring therapy in the great outdoors. If you liked what you heard in this episode, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes so we can share the magic of nature-based therapy with a wider audience of therapists who work with children who desperately need connection to nature nowadays, just like we do. If you're ready to take the next step in this adventure, join our free Therapy in the Great Outdoors community at therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com. The TGO community is a private space just for nature-based pediatric practitioners. We have loads of resources there to support you as you start or grow a nature-based practice or program. Our free TGO community has a discussion forum, a jobs and volunteers board, a crowdsourced treatment activities section, as well as free video trainings, research article reviews, and book recommendations from yours truly. Head on over to therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com to join today. So until next time, get outside, connect, reflect, and enjoy the business and practice of therapy in the great outdoors.